Hello, everybody, and welcome to Exclusively with Chris Lewis and me, Monica Paolini. And as always, we talk about how technology can help people with disabilities. And we have what is a disability? It's a broad thing, and so today we're going to talk about how to ensure the rights and have the proper standards. And what I would like to do is to ask Chris to introduce today's topic. So, Chris,
thanks, Monica. Thank you, Monica. Great to have us to be back on the brain, as it were. So Gill Whitney was introduced to us by a fellow independent analyst, Patrick Donegan, speaking at an ETSI conference. And of course, we're always talking about standards. We talk about the European Disability Act. We talk about WCAG, the different web standards. So I thought it was a perfect opportunity, Gill, to bring you in and get your perspectives about writing standards, more of the consumer perspective. But let's start by just perhaps you giving us a background to yourself, what you currently do, who you work with and for, and your views on that topic of accessibility and inclusion.
Oh, okay. Right. That's a big thing to cover. Yeah. Hi. Anyway, I'm Gill. I've worked as a technical expert for the Royal National Institute of Blind People. It was the full title when I was there a long time ago. And I've also been an academic in a department of computer science. Now I act as an independent expert, mainly paid, not always paid, to help write technical standards to ensure that they don't harm consumers, and that's real end users. And that, of course, includes a lot of people with disabilities and people who are non-standard users are more likely to be harmed because the designers are less likely to think about their requirements. And I'm currently working on standards on the European Cyber Resilience Act. The European Cyber Resilience Act, the standards that are written for it will be used around the world as as standards, which are effectively guidelines that manufacturers can follow to ensure that their products meet those goals under the best, to meet best practice, current best practice.
And if I take you back to the RNIB to put the context there, was that very much around physical devices and the standards around physical devices and having them designed to accommodate visually impaired people?
I sort of. I mean, I was at the RNIB over 30 years ago, and this was pre mobile smartphones.
Sure, yeah.
So most of the devices I worked on were things that were to try and give more information to blind people as they traveled, and smartphones have to a large extent replaced them. They haven't obviously replaced a cane or a dog. They're not going to stop you tripping over the next step, but they will helpfully enable you to find a safe way to travel. So actually, I suppose effectively most of what I did at the RNIB is now completely useless.
Well,
I also gave lots of advice to projects, other people doing research. That's probably still also useless.
So, may I ask you something? To introduce the topic here, is that we usually talk about how technology can help, and you seem to be sort of taking the other way approach, which I think is really important, to how to protect people. So maybe you can tell us about how the technology can protect people, which is not something that, Chris, we haven't really covered all that much.
Technology, and especially the early ideas of computing, was magical. It was brilliant. It could do anything. And we've got to a point more in a way that it's narrowed down, that computers, smartphones all have roughly the same shape. We're used to interfaces. There are problems now with people losing their sight, not realizing that you can use a phone completely without a smartphone without sight. And I think technology can be very useful if it's designed to meet the requirements of real people. And real people are not perfect in any way. We do stupid things, we make mistakes, we get distracted. And whether you've officially got a disability or not, will never be, you, me, anybody will never be the perfect user. And can I just say, there was a really interesting thing recently when the Amazon Web Services went down, the AWS, and one of the devices which started misbehaving was smart beds. And these smart beds the smart beds that was used Amazon Web Services depended on having a network connection. And if they didn't have a network connection, they went mad and you couldn't control them. There's no reason for a bed to require a network connection unless the people want to be able to update it. But if it works when you get it, it should carry on working. But they are a network device. You can control them from an app, well, except if the service is down. And this led to a lot of jokes and stupid rich people will have to lie on the floor, or they'll have to get out of bed with being helped up. But of course, the real people who got harmed was anybody who needed a smart bed, because it helped them move, it helped them position themselves. And so technology is potentially very useful, but you have to work out who it's being designed for. And if it's just being designed for the fictional perfect user and to make as much money as possible, it's going to be limited.
It does beg that question, doesn't it, of all the connected world in which we increasingly live, about them being hacked and being, lights flashing when you don't want them flashing, or heat changing, and as you said, the requirements for that smart bed, that movable bed to support, someone like, my mum's 92, still reasonably mobile, but she does need a lot of support. And I guess it goes back to your work with. Do you want to explain a bit about ANIC and that consumer view of it? Because how does that work with the bed manufacturers? Let's stick with beds for now.
All right. Okay. So most standards are not mandatory, i.e., they don't have to be followed. The cybersecurity standards I'm working on are, because they're linked to the European Cybersecurity Act, and in Europe, manufacturers will have to follow them to be able to sell their products. But most standards aren't followed or don't have to be followed. But if you want to show off that you've got good quality product, and if you want to sell it especially to markets where it's government buying them, you need to follow the standard. So there are committees, and there are hundreds of committees, and these start at the national level, then go up to regional level. And I mainly work in Europe, which includes the UK, and then there are international standards. And the standards are theoretically a group of experts, but they often tend towards people who've had long working histories, because it's not necessary. You can be paid by an organization for your time, but you can't. Most standard committees you're attending as an independent expert, and you're not paid by the standards body. And these standards are literally about trying to write the rules to ensure that the product is designed correctly, whatever correctly means, and that also the standard is followable, because it's the hardest thing. It's not just knowing how something should be designed, but actually enabling somebody else to understand what your standard means. So there are thousands and thousands of standards, and they range from, literally the shape of a plug, the voltage level, all that. There was once a really good poster, the British standards used to have two really good posters. One was each the number of standards to build a car, and of course it's hundreds. and it's everything from what the metal is to how it should work to the visibility for the driver, the stopping distance, all of those things. And the other was all the standards that, if they'd been in place, would have saved the Titanic, which was brilliant, really, because it was everything from the communication to the metal to the So a standard is a list of instructions, really.
Yeah, and
So
in the context of what we're looking at telecoms, then you mentioned ITU and Etsy obviously was how we got in touch. Are they particularly active? Are they particularly not active? How would you describe that?
The top level standards are the International Standards Organization and the International Telecommunications Union. So ISO and ITU, they are the world organizations. They have representatives from, and it's a vote from around the world, and they are active. Both ISO and ITU do work in the accessibility area. One of the standards I worked on many years ago was the standard for ISO on how to write standards so that they didn't discriminate against people with disabilities. But of course, this is working with industry. It is not mandatory for any standards person to follow that when they're writing their standard. It's useful information, but
but even if you have that requirement, I would imagine that most of the people that develop standards are sort of based on whatever the technology is. So they're kind of like on the engineering side of things. Yes. And in order to understand who are the real people, as you put it correctly, there is sort of like a different type of skill and knowledge required, I would imagine, that is not typical in the sort of educational or practical background of people. So how can they might be well intended, but they might not even have the knowledge of how to approach this issue.
No, but there are specific accessibility standards, such as the web access standards, and B, there are ways of getting this information in. One of the things I enjoy about doing the cybersecurity standards that I'm working on is the fact that they are cybersecurity standards, but the specification for them, written by the EU, refers to the end users and it refers to accessibility. So a lot of cybersecurity standards are purely technical. And at some level, there are some standards which have to be purely technical. That's fine. But the standards for the Cyber Resilience Act cannot all be purely technical. They will have a bit about the end users. And I was in a meeting this morning about the standards that's actually being led by Etsy, and it's the cybersecurity standard, and it's about children's toys, internet-connected children's toys. And one of the things, one of the things we actually started with on the meeting today was the fact that, okay, it's a child's toy, but it will be used by people of adult proportions size, because some adults will want to play with children's toys, some older people will be given children's toys, and also most children have an adult attached somewhere in their life who will be using the child toy. Yeah.
Okay, we play with them, don't we? Yeah. That's how with kids, that's how we got on. And in fact, that's really interesting. So there's the sort of two groups. There's the design of the product and the physical things that we might use in our homes, toys or at work. And then there's the cyber bit, the online bit, which is, that is the Wild West, isn't it? In terms of how do you make something usable for everybody? I mean, is that, how impossible a task is that, Jill? I mean, is that like a hell of a mountain to climb?
It is possible, but in many ways, it's as more technology is used, it's getting more complicated, and as technology increasingly infiltrates the real world, it becomes more and more difficult. But there has been also progress, I think, in ensuring that you don't blame the end user when things go wrong, because it's very easier with cybersecurity to say, well, you should have done that. You should, the user should have, if they know more. If you weren't so stupid, you wouldn't have pressed that button, sort of thing.
But we all have, yeah.
Yeah, and of course everybody has, and there is nobody who, yeah. But I think there are bigger questions that go outside standards, which is and about technology. What do we want AI for? How much do we want to infiltrate that? And that is outside my area in every way. I think we should I would like to live in a fantasy world where we used technology which was useful and or fun, and we didn't waste a whole load of, having people making money who are effectively trying to get clicks which will give them money, and those clicks are on something which is completely and utterly useless.
Could you give us one example of some, standard that seemed like reasonably good, but then it's like it failed, disabled people or a bunch of, and how that can get fixed? Because it's like, it'd be kind of good to have something like, here is, practical example.
Okay, a lot of standards are never used, and a lot of standards are possibly not usable because it takes a long time to write them. They are theoretically always written by consensus, and getting a group of people who are mainly dominated by industry, but possibly with some people, or a person trying to represent consumers, the standards it takes a long time to get consensus, and there are a lot of internal politics within them. Standards can be useless because it takes too long to write them, and what the technology they were designed for is never used. Alternatively, standards are useless because the market the people who could benefit from knowing it are never going to buy the standard. And most Etsy standards are free. That's in Europe, but there are the standards from the national, regional, or international bodies companies have to pay for. So if you don't, and because standards cost money, most students at university, technical students, will not do courses in standards. So you can.
Wow.
So yeah, unless you go to university in Germany, when there you get them free.
Right. And the way in which that sort of manifests itself in design, because obviously we touch a lot on this notion of inclusive design. If you haven't touched standards, then and while you were talking on the last couple of things, my brain was thinking about robots in home robots and the way robots are designed. And of course, they are going to be connected to what's going on in the home. They're going to be connected out to the internet. Perhaps they'll be connected to a specific model. Who knows what? I mean, if people aren't using the standards and they're not compliant, I mean, what would for example, and this may be way out of your scope, but for example, what would a home robot need to comply with standard-wise?
Oh, well, there will be a huge amount of standards for a home robot. And those would partly be the basic technical standards for, connecting to the network, getting power, all those elements. There are also safety standards with respect to the size, the weight, the pressure, the amount of force it could use for something. And something when it moves, if it moves, how it's safe. So there would be the technical standards to get it actually working, the safety standards to ensure that it could not do harm. It would also, like most, if it's connected to the internet, there are all the cybersecurity standards. I mean, there are a lot of them about already. It depends, and then there will be a whole load of other things, because what's your robot doing? How's it sensing things? What's it, how much does it weigh? Is it collecting personal information? In which case we got all the data protection. So how many? Yeah, there are a lot. That's not a very useful answer. Sorry.
No, but it's incredible. No, the weight thing, the pressure it can apply. I'd never thought about that. But
Also,
and then, go on.
yeah, I mean, there will be things about the temperature. If it's a home robot, including a small oven, there's all the standards about how hot it can get.
Wow.
And one of the reasons, one of the things that the reasons why ANIC does a lot of work in the disability field was it's ANIC's 30 years old, but when it started, and still to some extent, there were exclusions in technical standards for domestic appliances.
Oh, really?
And these exclusions were for things like toasters and kettles. And so the standards were designed for the devices to be safe, but not when they were used by a child, i.e. somebody under 18, or by somebody with a disability,
Wow.
If you were a blind parent, you weren't supposed to use the toaster or the kettle, theoretically.
Well, interestingly, we're in the process of looking at an induction hob.
Yes.
And obviously we're trying to find the ones that are most accessible.
Yes.
Because obviously I do cook on occasion, very, very much enjoy it. But actually the way in which they work, the way you control the temperature, the way you switch them on and off, I'm finding that fascinating about how some of them will have an app to control it. I don't really want an app to control it. I want controls that on the device that are accessible. But once again, when it's a flat pane of glass, it's a bit more exclusionary than many things. Although, as you well said, from the way the iPhone and Samsung device are now designed, that's a flat bit of glass, and we do have access to it. So, yeah, really interesting, practical application of standards, certainly.
Yeah, and of course, every time you use an app, there's another layer of things that can go wrong, and all the cybersecurity problems, which you don't have if you don't have to use an app.
Well, one of my lessons recently, I've been started to use hearing aids because I'm losing hearing in my right ear, and my initial thought was I want to be able to control it from my phone. What I've realized subsequently is actually that, just as you say, adds a layer of complexity. The app's badly designed, and actually, as long as the hearing aids are set up properly with buttons to change program and volume, leave it self-contained. You don't have to connect everything to everything. And I think in our world of connectivity, from the telecom view, the assumption is you do need to connect everything to everything. And I see much more, segmented things just connected to what it needs to be connected to, not connected to everything. So,
yeah, and there are people on the technical political level who are lobbying for not to have an app on everything, but to have remote controls, to have real controls. But of course, that costs the manufacturers more than the coding. Also, with respect to your hearing aids, I've got somebody who does a friend who does standards in the area of audio, and he is really concerned that enough warnings are not given out to people about hearing aids, the fact they've got a battery in. There's a lot of advice about don't let your small child swallow batteries, but they don't, and it is possibly more difficult to swallow a hearing aid, but it's not impossible. The new ones come very small. And do you think actually my child swallowing my hearing aids is as bad as swallowing a battery?
Yeah, well, I suppose the in-ear ones are literally that
not
small,
the
outer
ear one. Yeah, very difficult to swallow.
But Jill, okay, but let me just take it from the complete opposite things. As long as we have small things and we have kids might swallow them. So at some point, it's like, well, you just need to have good parent supervision. And I'm not quite sure that, is a standards the best way to go, because you cannot replace good sense. And so my question to you is that, could we get in a situation where we have so many standards that, as you said, they are expensive to write, they increase the cost of whatever you're doing, and at the end of the day, they actually make life more difficult rather than easier? I mean, where would you draw the line there?
A standard on the batteries inside hearing aids would never say you can't put them in. It would just say that if a device is below a certain size, it needs to contain a warning about swallowing. And just to remind people that that there is a battery in it, because it's not automatically to think about it. Yes, there are a lot of competing standards, but they're not mandatory unless they are unless they are directly referenced in the law, or they are referenced in with respect to how you sell it. So the cybersecurity standards being written at the moment, the majority are not, will never be mandatory. But if you want to put a CE mark on your goods, which is a mark of quality, you will then need to be able to show that you're full of the rules. But we spent a lot of time in standards meetings when you're writing a standard, you have normative text, which somebody has to follow, and informative text, which is designed to give the manufacturers information. So our standards, you can't design anything without standards. Nobody ever goes back to tries to work out, I'm old enough that my first computer didn't have really an operating system. I literally had to tell the components inside it what to do. The first database I ever used, I'd had to write before I could then, I was working in a hospital at the time, before anything could be put in it. Standards are necessary for technology because nobody is going back to invent the wheel. And especially Apple at one point used to make a big fuss about the fact that they didn't follow standards. And of course they did. All the code the programming code languages follow standards. The size of the plugs, you've got to be able to plug it, standards are everywhere. And they are potentially useful. But there are a lot of standards which are completely useless.
So Jill, can I draw things together a little bit? Because
sorry.
You talk no at all. So you talk about the ANIC taking it from a more consumer view.
Yes.
And one of the notions we keep talking about is that by designing things inclusively, actually grows your addressable market.
Yes.
Do you think in the interactions that the standards bodies have with, let's say, especially consumer electronics devices, which are, we think, many, if not most, will be internet connected and cyber threatenable. Do the manufacturers, consumer electronics people, do they see it as a way of expanding their market, or do they see it as oh damn, we need to comply with that so we get the quality stamp? Is that?
It depends what manufacturers you are thinking about. For the big companies that can afford to have people following standards and people involved in the writing of standards, it's definitely an essential part of how they work, and they want to show off that they've not done, the legal departments will want them to show that where necessary they have complied, but obviously then they'll be on the committees ensuring the standard is being written in a way that they can comply with.
Mm-hmm.
There are obviously problems with small organizations and small companies in getting access to standards and understanding how to read them, because you don't read a standard like you read a book. You need to just identify the small, standards can be, if printed out, huge thick books, but nobody would ever read it from start. You just need to find the few key points that tell you what to do.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of you mentioned the Cybersecurity Act. We've previously touched upon the European Accessibility Act. We've touched upon the European AI Act, which looks like it is being watered down a bit at the moment. Is there a Venn diagram in your head, or anywhere that the way those things all overlap? Because they from the discussion we just had, there is an overlap.
There is an overlap. There is, again, it comes back to the big companies can have departments and can consider how these things fit together, and they should fit together because but a good cybersecurity standard will always say and do anything else to ensure that your product is secure. And the various and there are, the standards in the area of AI will say, you've got to consider how it fits together, and it works like that.
Mm. Mm. Go on, Monica.
Yeah, so we actually are running out of time. So as
Sorry.
always, and it's always like when things get really interesting, we're like, oh, we have to go. But so Joe, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how do you see everything, your commitment, your work moving forward as we, as you say, well, AI is such a broad topic, but how is standardization changing when we have to, take into account all disabled, all the people out there are not just your ideal user.
And while you're thinking about that, shouldn't we be using AI to write the standards more?
AI is not very good on nuance. It really isn't. And you need to understand the nuance and the
Very
detail.
good.
Yeah. The future, most of the standards bodies are trying to ensure that eventually, well, no, that's a bit too rude, are trying to ensure that their websites are accessible. Should I, as a person, I mean, I can carry on doing technical standards. For the accessibility standards, a lot of people helping write with them do actually have disabilities, and that is very useful. What will happen in the future? I was an academic for 21 years. Standards should be educational, enable people to understand. And especially with technology, we've come down to very narrow views of what a smartphone looks like, or how technology works. And occasionally I walk down the street and I'll see somebody looking at their screen on their phone and then walking into me. And I think, but you don't need to look at it. It can talk to you. It can speak to you. It can do all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
They're even olfactory or smelly displays, but very few people use them. It could smell at you. So I standards linked to imagination could come up with brilliant products and made life really good for everybody, and we could all live happily ever after. We live in a capitalist society. I'm not too sure that's necessarily what's going to happen.
I think one thing does occur to me, Joe, whilst talking through all of this, is that perhaps a bit like telecoms used to be very isolated, just to make up its own rules and define its own standards. What the sort of the cyber world, the internet world has done to us is link so many more things together that used to be formally separate. And so standards, in the sense of my previous question about AI Act and Disability Act and all those things, the overlap has become much more evident. There probably wasn't overlap in the past. And say we designed technology in the past for particular disabilities. I think the potential is certainly there to design for everybody, but there needs to be that understanding, as you say, with the people representative on the standards bodies who are on that cognitive view of the world, different cognitive view of the world, different physical view of the world. Hearing and seeing are sort of pretty well understood. Physical, pretty well understood. I think that the way in which we as humans interact with the internet over whatever device, over whatever interface, and how that is shaped by our cognitive status is I can't get my head around it, and I'm sure plenty of people are doing it. But that design, the fact that we design web pages, basically how we used to design almost like books or magazines, is so wrong, isn't it? One of my big hopes for AI is that it simplifies the interface with which, and we can choose the interface with which we want to interact with it. So whether we speak to a butler concierge type product that does everything for us, but then the standards of how they interact with other ones, in the same way we have the problem with agentic AI at the moment. There's so many agents going to be flying around the system. They need to be able to talk to each other and respect each other. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is this: the standards issue is not going away. I suspect it's getting more and more complicated.
Yes. And behind the scenes, this isn't necessarily disability specific. There are standards about what to do with what the system should do when something goes wrong.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
with the and also under the Cyber Resilience Act, you not only are you considering the user, but you have to consider the bystander who might be impacted by this device. And when the computer's designing something that's affecting people in the real world, it gets really complicated. That's the main interest, of course, is it's really complicated and possibly unsolvable.
Yeah. Yes, I did see something yesterday with one of our fellow independent analysts was in Miami, and how one bigger robot shoved another robot off the pavement in Miami. Like, Monica, close us down.
Until the robots hit each other, it's not a big deal. That's not Well, Gill, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It was a great conversation and a lot to think about. So thank you so much. And thank you all on me and Chris's behalf for listening to Inclusively, and let others know about it, and spread the word. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gill. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah.